The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of London as thousands of people lined the ceremonial route. Today was different from any other day in the city's long history. The nation was saying goodbye to their beloved queen, and the weight of grief hung heavy in the air like a thick fog that refused to lift. Among the sea of faces stood Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old teacher from Manchester, clutching the small hand of her 6-year-old daughter, Emma. They had traveled down the night before, sleeping in their small car just to secure a good spot along the procession route. Sarah's eyes were already red from crying, but she was determined to be here, to pay her respects to the woman who had been a constant presence throughout her entire life. Emma didn't fully understand what was happening. She knew the Queen had died, and that everyone was very sad, but, at 6 years old, the concept of death was still abstract to her young mind. What she did understand was that her mother was crying, and that made her feel scared and confused. She pressed closer to Sarah's leg, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her mother's black dress. The crowd around them was unusually quiet for such a large gathering. Normally, when this many people came together in London, there would be chatter, laughter, the usual buzz of human interaction. But, today, the silence was profound, broken only by occasional sniffles and the distant sound of church bells tolling across the city. Sarah looked down at Emma, who was wearing her best dress, a navy blue one with small white flowers that Sarah had bought for her school's Easter program just months earlier. The little girl's blonde hair was neatly braided, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that they had picked from their garden before leaving Manchester. Sarah had explained that they were going to say goodbye to the Queen, and Emma had insisted on bringing flowers because that's what you do when someone goes to heaven. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew thicker. People from all walks of life had come to witness this historic moment. There were elderly couples who remembered the Queen's coronation 70 years ago, middle-aged professionals who had taken time off work, families with young children, and teenagers who had never known a world without her. The diversity of the crowd was remarkable, yet they were all united in their shared sense of loss. Behind the barriers that kept the crowds in order, members of the Royal Guard stood at attention. These were not just ceremonial soldiers, they were active military personnel, trained to maintain perfect composure regardless of the circumstances. Their red uniforms were immaculate, their bearskin hats perfectly positioned, and their faces showed no emotion. They had been standing for hours, and would continue to stand for hours more, as still as statues, as professional as any soldiers in the world. One of these guards was Sergeant James Morrison, a 28-year-old from Scotland who had served in the Guard for 6 years. He had participated in countless ceremonial events, from state visits to royal weddings, but nothing had prepared him for the emotional weight of this day. Despite his training to remain stoic and professional, James was struggling internally with his own grief. The Queen had been his commander-in-chief, and, like so many in the military, he felt a personal connection to her that went beyond duty. James stood perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead, but he was acutely aware of the crowd just meters away from him. He could hear the quiet sobs, the whispered conversations, the rustling of flowers being arranged. The atmosphere was unlike anything he had experienced in his military career. Usually, ceremonial events were celebrations, joyous occasions where the crowd's energy was uplifting. Today, the collective grief was almost overwhelming. As the hours passed, Emma grew restless. She had been standing in one spot for what felt like forever to her young mind, and the sadness of all the adults around her was making her anxious. She tugged on her mother's dress repeatedly, asking when they could go home, when the parade would start, why everyone was so quiet. Sarah tried to explain, but how do you help a 6-year-old understand the magnitude of what was happening? The little girl's attention began to wander, and that's when she noticed the soldier standing perfectly still just a few meters away. James, in his bright red uniform and tall black hat, looked like something out of a fairy tale to Emma. She had seen pictures of the Royal Guard before, but never one in real life. She was fascinated by how still he could stand, how straight his posture was, how he didn't even seem to blink. Emma whispered to her mother, asking about the soldier, but Sarah was too overwhelmed by her own emotions to pay much attention to her daughter's questions. The weight of the day, the lack of sleep from spending the night in the car, and the profound sadness she felt were all taking their toll. She answered Emma's questions with half-hearted responses, not really engaging with her daughter's curiosity. As the morning wore on, the atmosphere in the crowd became even more somber. News was spreading through the gathered people about the details of the funeral service, about the members of the royal family who would be in attendance, about the significance of various traditions that would be observed. For many, this was not just the funeral of a monarch, it was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in British history that had spanned 7 decades. Emma, however, was becoming increasingly focused on the guard. She watched him with the intense concentration that only children possess, studying every detail of his uniform, trying to understand how he could stand so perfectly still for so long. In her innocent mind, she began to wonder if he was sad too, if under that tall hat and, behind that serious expression, he was feeling the same sadness that seemed to surround everyone else. The crowd around them continued to grow, and people were pressed closer together. Emma found herself squeezed between adults, her view of everything blocked except for the soldier who had captured her attention. She could see that his hands, which held his rifle in a ceremonial position, were completely steady, but she thought she noticed something different about his eyes when she caught brief glimpses of his face. Meanwhile, James was indeed struggling with his emotions. The Queen had been a constant in his life, just as she had been for millions of others. He remembered watching her on television as a child, remembered the day he took his oath to serve her when he joined the military, remembered the pride he felt the first time he stood guard at one of her residences. Now, as he stood in his ceremonial position, he was fighting back tears while maintaining the perfect composure required of his role. The sound of approaching drums in the distance signaled that the funeral procession was getting closer. The crowd's anticipation was palpable, but it was an anticipation mixed with dread. Everyone wanted to pay their respects, but no one wanted this day to actually be happening. The reality that they were about to witness the final journey of their queen was settling in, and the emotional weight was becoming almost unbearable. Sarah felt her own composure beginning to crack as the drums grew louder. She had loved the Queen in the way that many British people did, with a deep respect that went beyond politics or personal opinion. The Queen had been a symbol of stability, of continuity, of something unchanging in a world that seemed to change faster every year. Now that stability was gone, and Sarah felt like she was grieving not just for the Queen, but for the certainty she represented. Emma sensed her mother's increasing distress and pressed closer to her, but her eyes remained fixed on the guard. She noticed that despite his perfect posture and professional demeanor, there seemed to be something different about him now. Maybe it was the way he blinked a little more frequently, or the slight tension in his jaw, but, to her observant young eyes, he seemed to be struggling with something. In that moment, something remarkable happened. Emma's natural empathy, the instinctive compassion that children often possess before the world teaches them to suppress it, was triggered. She recognized pain in another person, even though that person was a stranger, even though he was trying his best to hide it. Without fully understanding why, she felt compelled to do something, to offer some kind of comfort. The little girl looked up at her mother, who was now openly crying as the sound of the funeral procession grew closer. Emma realized that everyone around her was sad, that this was a day of overwhelming sadness, and that even the strong soldier who looked like he could protect everyone was feeling it too. Her 6-year-old mind couldn't comprehend the full scope of what was happening, but she understood sadness, and she understood that sometimes people needed help when they were sad. Emma looked down at the small bouquet of wildflowers in her hand, the ones they had picked from their garden that morning. Her mother had told her they were to say goodbye to the Queen, but, suddenly, Emma had a different idea about who might need them more. She looked back up at the guard, then, at her flowers, and began to formulate a plan that would soon change everything. The drums were getting louder now, and the crowd was beginning to stir with anticipation. In just a few minutes, the funeral procession would pass by, and this historic day would reach its most significant moment. But, for one little girl, the most important moment was yet to come, and it would have nothing to do with the pageantry and protocol of a royal funeral, and everything to do with the simple human need for compassion and connection. The sound of the approaching funeral procession filled the air with a somber rhythm that seemed to synchronize the heartbeats of thousands of people lining the streets. The drums, played by military bands, created a cadence that was both majestic and mournful, a fitting soundtrack for this unprecedented moment in British history. Emma could feel the vibration of the drums through the ground beneath her feet, and she noticed how everyone around her seemed to stand a little straighter, preparing themselves for what they were about to witness. James Morrison maintained his rigid posture, but internally he was battling emotions that threatened to overwhelm his professional training. The approaching sound of the funeral march was triggering memories he hadn't expected. He remembered the first time he had seen the Queen in person, during a ceremony at Windsor Castle 3 years earlier. She had been so small, so elderly, yet she had commanded such respect and dignity that everyone in her presence felt honored to be there. He remembered how she had spoken briefly to each member of the guard that day, asking about their families, their service, making each of them feel seen and valued. The crowd around Emma and Sarah had grown even denser, with people pressing forward to get the best possible view of the procession. Sarah was struggling to keep Emma close to her side while managing her own overwhelming emotions. The reality of what was happening was hitting her in waves. This wasn't just a ceremonial event they were attending, this was the end of the longest reign in British history, the conclusion of a life that had touched millions of people around the world. Emma, still fascinated by the motionless guard, had been quietly observing him for what felt like hours. In her young mind, she had created an entire story about him. She imagined that under his big black hat, he had kind eyes. She thought about how tired his feet must be from standing so still for so long. She wondered if he had a family waiting for him at home, if he had children like her, if he ever smiled when he wasn't working. But, most importantly, Emma had noticed something that the adults around her were too distracted to see. Despite his perfect military bearing, despite his training and professionalism, the guard was struggling. She could see it in the slight tremor in his hands that he was trying to control, in the way he occasionally took a deeper breath, in the subtle changes in his expression that only someone watching him as intently as she was would notice. The funeral procession was now clearly visible in the distance. The sight of the horse-drawn carriage carrying the Queen's coffin, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, caused a collective intake of breath from the crowd. Many people who had been holding back their emotions finally broke down completely. The reality of the Queen's death, which had seemed abstract despite the days of news coverage, suddenly became undeniably real. Sarah gasped and covered her mouth with her hand as fresh tears streamed down her face. Like many people her age, Sarah had never known a world without the Queen. She had been a constant presence throughout Sarah's childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. The Queen had been there during Sarah's school days, when she graduated from university, when she got married, when Emma was born. Now, watching the coffin pass by, Sarah felt like she was losing not just a monarch, but a grandmother figure who had provided stability and continuity throughout her entire life. Emma looked up at her mother's tearful face, then back at the guard. She noticed that his hands were gripping his rifle more tightly now, and she thought she saw his jaw clench slightly. The little girl's empathetic heart was breaking for everyone around her, but especially for the soldier who was trying so hard to be strong when everyone else was allowed to cry. As the funeral procession drew closer, the ceremonial aspects became more apparent. Members of the royal family walked solemnly behind the coffin, their faces masks of grief and dignity. The precision of the military units, the slow cadence of the horses, the perfect synchronization of hundreds of participants created a spectacle that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. This was British pageantry at its most magnificent, yet it was in service of the saddest of occasions. James could see the procession approaching from the corner of his eye, but his training prevented him from turning his head to look directly. He had to rely on his peripheral vision and the changing sounds to track its progress. As the Queen's coffin came closer, he felt his chest tighten with emotion. This woman, who had been his sovereign and commander-in-chief, was making her final journey, and he was honored to be standing guard along her route, but the weight of the moment was almost unbearable. Emma had been watching the guard so intently that she noticed immediately when his breathing changed, when his posture shifted almost imperceptibly as he struggled to maintain his composure. The 6-year-old didn't understand the full significance of what was happening around her, but she understood that everyone was sad, and that this particular person was trying to be brave while feeling very sad inside. The little girl looked down at her bouquet of wildflowers again. They were simple flowers, picked from her family's small garden behind their terraced house in Manchester. There were daisies, buttercups, and a few sprigs of lavender that her grandmother had planted years ago. Nothing fancy or expensive, but they were beautiful in their simplicity, and Emma had picked each one carefully, thinking about how much she loved the Queen and wanted to say goodbye properly. But now, looking at the flowers and then at the struggling guard, Emma felt something stirring inside her that she couldn't quite understand or articulate. She felt the urge to help, to do something kind, to make someone feel better in a moment when everything felt sad and scary. The guard looked like he needed help, like he needed someone to tell him it was okay to be sad, that he didn't have to be strong all by himself. The procession was now directly in front of them, moving slowly and solemnly past the crowds. The sight of the Queen's coffin, so close that Emma could see the intricate details of the royal standard, was overwhelming for everyone present. The crowd fell into an even deeper silence, with only the sound of the drums, the horses' hooves on the cobblestones, and the occasional sob breaking the quiet. Sarah was completely absorbed in watching the procession, her hand pressed to her heart as she tried to process what she was seeing. This was a moment she would remember for the rest of her life, a piece of living history unfolding before her eyes. She was so focused on the spectacle that she didn't notice when Emma gently pulled her hand away and took a small step toward the barrier. James felt his emotions reaching a breaking point as the Queen's coffin passed directly in front of his position. Despite his years of training, despite his absolute commitment to maintaining proper protocol, he found himself struggling to keep his composure. The woman who had sworn him in, who had been the focal point of his oath of service, was passing by for the last time, and the finality of it was overwhelming. Emma saw the moment when the guard's control wavered. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not watching as closely as she was, but she saw his shoulders tremble slightly, saw him blink rapidly several times, saw him take a sharp breath as he fought against his emotions. In that instant, Emma's young heart broke for him, and, without thinking about rules or protocol or consequences, she made a decision that would change everything. The little girl squeezed through the legs of the adults around her and ducked under the barrier that separated the crowd from the ceremonial area. Her mother, still focused on the passing procession, didn't immediately notice her daughter's movement. Emma walked with determination toward the guard, her small bouquet clutched tightly in her hands, her young face serious with purpose. James became aware of movement in his peripheral vision and realized with alarm that someone had crossed the barrier. His first instinct was to maintain his position, but when he saw that it was a small child walking directly toward him, his training conflicted with his natural concern for her safety. He couldn't break formation, but he also couldn't ignore a child who might be in danger. Emma stopped directly in front of James, looking up at him with her innocent blue eyes. She was so small that she barely reached his waist, and the contrast between the towering, imposing guard and the tiny girl created a scene that would soon capture the attention of everyone around them. The little girl held up her bouquet of wildflowers, offering them to the guard with a gesture so pure and compassionate that it seemed to stop time itself. For a moment, James didn't know what to do. His training told him to maintain his position, to ignore distractions, to remain professional at all costs. But, looking down at this small child, who had somehow sensed his emotional struggle and had risked getting in trouble to offer him comfort, he felt something crack inside his carefully maintained composure. Emma spoke quietly, her young voice barely audible above the sound of the drums, but her words carried with surprising clarity in the stillness around them. "These are for you," she said simply, still holding up the flowers. "My mummy says flowers make people feel better when they're sad. You look sad, and I thought maybe you needed them more than the Queen does, because she's in heaven now and probably has lots of flowers already." The impact of Emma's words and gesture rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. The people closest to them noticed first, their attention drawn away from the passing procession to this unexpected human moment unfolding right in front of them. Sarah finally realized that Emma was no longer beside her and looked around frantically until she spotted her daughter standing in front of the guard. The moment Emma offered her flowers to James Morrison seemed to exist outside of time itself. The thunderous sound of the drums, the clip-clop of horses' hooves, and the collective breath of thousands of mourners faded into background noise as this singular interaction captured the attention of everyone within sight. James looked down at the little girl, his professional composure warring with the overwhelming human emotion that her simple act of kindness had unleashed within him. For several seconds that felt like hours, James remained perfectly still, following his training even as his heart pounded against his chest. But, as he looked into Emma's innocent blue eyes, as he saw the genuine concern and compassion in her young face, as he processed her words about the Queen already having flowers in heaven, something fundamental shifted inside him. The rigid walls of protocol that had defined his military service began to crack under the weight of pure human connection. Sarah Mitchell pushed through the crowd desperately, her face flushed with panic and embarrassment. "Emma," she called out in a harsh whisper, trying not to disrupt the solemnity of the funeral procession while also terrified that her daughter had somehow violated royal protocol in the most public way imaginable. She reached the barrier and started to climb over, motivated by the maternal instinct to protect her child from whatever consequences might follow this breach of ceremony. But before Sarah could reach her daughter, before security personnel could respond to the situation, before anyone could restore the proper order of things, James Morrison made a decision that would define not just this moment, but the rest of his life. Slowly, carefully, while maintaining his ceremonial stance as much as possible, he shifted his rifle to one hand and reached down with his free hand to accept Emma's offering. The flowers looked impossibly small in James's large, gloved hand. The simple wildflowers that Emma had picked from her family's modest garden seemed almost insignificant against the backdrop of royal pageantry and military precision. But, as James's fingers closed gently around the stems, as he felt the soft petals against his palm, the gesture carried more weight than any medal or commendation he had ever received. Emma's face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the grey London morning. She had accomplished what she set out to do. She had offered comfort to someone who needed it, and her gesture had been accepted. The little girl didn't understand the significance of what was happening around them, didn't realize that millions of people around the world would soon see this moment, didn't know that she had just participated in something that would be remembered long after the formal ceremonies were forgotten. The crowd around them was now completely focused on this unexpected scene. Many people had their phones out, recording or photographing what they were witnessing. The contrast between the formal military ceremony and this spontaneous act of human kindness was striking, and people instinctively recognized that they were seeing something extraordinary, something that captured the essence of what this day was really about beneath all the protocol and pageantry. James felt tears filling his eyes as he held the flowers, and, for the first time in his 6-year career as a royal guard, he didn't try to suppress them. The little girl's act of kindness had broken through every barrier he had built to maintain his professional composure, and he found himself experiencing the full weight of his grief for the Queen, his gratitude for this child's empathy, and his amazement at the unexpected connection that had formed between them. Sarah finally reached Emma and gently took her daughter's hand, her own eyes now filled with tears for entirely different reasons than before. Where she had expected to feel embarrassment or fear about Emma's breach of protocol, she instead felt an overwhelming sense of pride in her daughter's compassionate heart. Watching this interaction, seeing how her 6-year-old had instinctively reached out to comfort a stranger in his moment of need, Sarah realized that Emma had understood something about this day that many adults had missed. The funeral procession continued to move past them, but now there was a secondary focus of attention. Word began to spread through the crowd about what had just happened. People who had been entirely absorbed in watching the Queen's coffin pass by were now turning to see the guard holding a small bouquet of wildflowers and the little girl who had given them to him. The story began to ripple outward, passed from person to person in whispered conversations that somehow managed to convey the emotional impact of what they had witnessed. Emma looked up at James one more time before her mother led her back toward the crowd. "I hope you feel better now," she said quietly, her young voice carrying the kind of sincerity that only children possess. "My mummy says that when we're kind to people, it makes everyone feel better, even us." James nodded slightly, the only acknowledgement he could give while maintaining his ceremonial duties, but the gesture conveyed everything he couldn't say aloud. The little girl had indeed made him feel better, had reminded him that even in moments of profound loss and formal ceremony, human connection and kindness could break through to touch the heart. He would carry her flowers, and the memory of her gesture, with him long after this day ended. As Sarah let Emma back into the crowd, the little girl continued to look back at the guard, satisfied that she had done something good. She didn't understand why so many people were now looking at them, didn't realize that photographers from major news organizations had captured their interaction, didn't know that her simple act of giving flowers to a sad soldier would soon be seen by people all over the world. The immediate area around James became a focal point of attention as people began to realize that something significant had just occurred. Other members of the Royal Guard maintained their positions with perfect discipline, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, an acknowledgement that something beautiful and unexpected had happened in the midst of their solemn duty. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Emma, Sarah, or James, photographers and camera operators who had been positioned to capture images of the funeral procession had noticed the interaction and had documented it from multiple angles. The images they captured would soon make their way to newsrooms around the world, where editors would immediately recognize the power of what they were seeing. The contrast was perfect for the media narrative that would emerge, the rigid formality of royal protocol and military ceremony set against the spontaneous, pure-hearted gesture of a child. Here was a story that embodied everything people needed to feel on this difficult day: the continuation of human kindness, the bridge between generations, the reminder that even in our most formal and structured moments, genuine emotion and connection could still break through. The funeral procession had now passed completely by their section of the route, but the crowd remained energized by what they had witnessed. People were talking animatedly about Emma's gesture, sharing their own emotional responses to seeing such pure kindness displayed in such an unexpected context. Many people who had felt overwhelmed by the formality and grandeur of the royal funeral found themselves instead talking about a 6-year-old girl and her flowers, about the human moment that had somehow become the most meaningful part of the day for them. Social media began to buzz with posts about the interaction, though the full impact wouldn't be felt until the professional photographs and video footage made their way into major news outlets. People who had witnessed the moment firsthand were already posting about it, using words like beautiful, touching, and heartwarming to describe what they had seen. The story was beginning to take on a life of its own, spreading organically through the networks of people who understood instinctively that they had witnessed something special. James continued to stand at his post, the wildflowers carefully held in his hand, trying to process what had just happened to him. In 6 years of ceremonial duty, he had never experienced anything like this. He had stood guard at weddings and state dinners, had been present for celebrations and formal occasions, but nothing had ever affected him the way this simple interaction with a child had. The flowers in his hand felt like they weighed nothing and everything at the same time. As the immediate excitement of the funeral procession began to die down, as the formal ceremonies moved to other locations, as the crowds started to disperse, the story of Emma and James was just beginning. What had started as a spontaneous act of kindness from a compassionate child was about to become something much larger, something that would touch hearts around the world and remind people of the power of simple human connection. The seeds of a global phenomenon had been planted in that moment when a 6-year-old girl decided that a sad soldier needed flowers more than a queen who was already in heaven. Neither Emma nor James could have imagined that their brief interaction would soon be discussed in living rooms, shared on social media, featured in news broadcasts, and remembered as one of the most touching moments of a historic day. But, for now, in the immediate aftermath of their encounter, both Emma and James were simply processing their own emotions. Emma felt the satisfaction of having helped someone, while James felt the profound impact of unexpected kindness. Neither of them knew that within hours, their story would begin spreading across the globe, touching millions of hearts and reminding the world that even in our most formal and ceremonial moments, the simple human acts of compassion and connection remain the most powerful forces of all. Within hours of the funeral procession ending, the first photograph appeared on social media. It was taken by a bystander with a smartphone, slightly blurry but capturing the essence of the moment perfectly: a tiny girl in a navy dress offering flowers to a towering royal guard in his ceremonial red uniform. The image was shared with a simple caption: "This little girl just gave her flowers to one of the guards. My heart is broken in the best way." The post began gathering likes and shares at an extraordinary rate. People were immediately drawn to the powerful contrast in the image, the vulnerability and kindness it represented in the midst of such formal ceremony. Comments poured in from people who were emotionally moved by what they were seeing, many sharing their own experiences of being touched by unexpected acts of kindness from children. Meanwhile, professional photographers who had captured the moment from multiple angles were rushing to get their images to their news organizations. Photo editors at major newspapers and magazines around the world immediately recognized the significance of what they were looking at. This wasn't just a nice human interest story, this was the kind of image that would define how people remembered this historic day. Emma Mitchell had no idea that she was about to become famous. After leaving the ceremonial route, she and her mother Sarah had found a small cafe where they could sit and process what they had experienced. Emma was more interested in her hot chocolate than in discussing the day's events, occasionally mentioning the nice soldier but mostly just tired from the long morning of standing in crowds. Sarah, however, was beginning to understand that something extraordinary had happened. Other people in the cafe were talking about a little girl who had given flowers to a guard, and Sarah gradually realized they were talking about Emma. She felt a mixture of pride and concern, proud of her daughter's compassionate heart but worried about what kind of attention this might bring to their quiet family life. James Morrison completed his ceremonial duties that afternoon, still carrying Emma's flowers. His commanding officers had noticed what happened but had chosen not to comment, recognizing that the gesture had been received rather than initiated, and that James had maintained his professional bearing throughout the interaction. When his shift ended, James carefully preserved the flowers, placing them in water in his quarters, unable to throw away something that had meant so much to him. By evening, the story had exploded across traditional media. The photograph of Emma offering flowers to James appeared on the front pages of newspapers around the world. Television news programs led with the story, describing it as a moment of pure human kindness that had captured the world's attention during a day of mourning and ceremony. The headlines varied, but they all captured the same sentiment: girl, 6, touches hearts worldwide with gesture to royal guard, the flowers that moved the world, a child's kindness becomes symbol of hope. News organizations that had planned to focus entirely on the formal aspects of the royal funeral found themselves leading with this unexpected human story instead. Social media platforms crashed repeatedly as the image and video clips of the interaction were shared millions of times within the first 24 hours. The hashtag flowers for the guard began trending globally, with people sharing their own stories of kindness, their emotional responses to Emma's gesture, and their thoughts about what the moment represented in a world that often seemed divided and harsh. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with people from different countries, cultures, and backgrounds all finding something meaningful in Emma's simple act of giving flowers to a soldier who looked sad. Mental health advocates praised the moment as an example of emotional intelligence and empathy. Military families shared their own stories of the emotional challenges faced by service members who must maintain professional composure during difficult situations. Child psychologists were interviewed about what Emma's behavior revealed about natural human empathy and the importance of encouraging kindness in children. Religious leaders spoke about the moment as an example of pure love and compassion transcending social boundaries. Even politicians, usually careful about commenting on royal ceremonies, found themselves moved to speak about the significance of what the little girl had done. 3 days after the funeral, Sarah's phone began ringing constantly as news organizations tried to reach her family for interviews. The Mitchell family had been identified through social media detective work, though they had not initially sought any publicity. Sarah was overwhelmed by the attention and uncertain about whether to engage with the media requests. The first major interview request came from a prestigious morning television show. The producer who called Sarah explained that they wanted to do a respectful segment about Emma's gesture and its impact on people around the world. They offered to come to Manchester rather than requiring the family to travel to London, understanding that this was an ordinary family thrust into extraordinary circumstances. After discussing it with her husband David, who had been at work during the funeral and had come home to discover his daughter had become an international sensation, Sarah decided to accept one interview. They felt that Emma's act of kindness deserved to be celebrated, and they wanted to ensure that the message about compassion and empathy wasn't lost in the media attention. The interview, conducted in the Mitchell family's modest living room in Manchester, was watched by millions of people around the world. Emma, still only 6 years old, was charming and natural on camera, explaining in her simple way that she had given the flowers to the soldier because he looked sad and her grandmother had always told her that flowers made people feel better. When the interviewer asked Emma if she understood that her gesture had touched people all over the world, the little girl looked confused. "I just gave him some flowers," she said. "Why is that special?" "That's what you're supposed to do when someone is sad." Her innocent response only endeared her further to viewers and reinforced the message that kindness should be natural and expected, not exceptional. The interview also featured a surprise video message from James Morrison, who had received permission from his superiors to speak publicly about the experience. In his message, James thanked Emma for her kindness and explained how much her gesture had meant to him during a very difficult day. He spoke about the flowers, which he had carefully dried and preserved, and how they would always remind him of the power of compassion and human connection. The response to the interview was extraordinary. Flowers began arriving at the Mitchell family home from people around the world who had been moved by Emma's story. The family received thousands of letters and cards, many from children who had been inspired by Emma's example to perform their own acts of kindness. Schools began incorporating Emma's story into lessons about empathy and citizenship. Teachers used the moment as an example of how children could make a difference in the world through simple acts of kindness. Parents shared the story with their children as an example of doing the right thing even when nobody was watching or expecting recognition. The royal family themselves acknowledged the moment in a rare personal statement, expressing their appreciation for Emma's gesture and noting how it had brought joy and hope to people during a time of mourning. The statement emphasized that the Queen, who had always valued kindness and service to others, would have been touched by Emma's compassionate heart. A month after the funeral, Emma and her family were invited to visit James Morrison at his barracks. The meeting was private, arranged away from media attention, allowing the two to reconnect in a quiet setting. Emma brought James a new bouquet of flowers from her garden, and James presented her with a small gift, a teddy bear dressed in a miniature Royal Guard uniform. During their visit, James showed Emma around the barracks and explained what it meant to be a Royal Guard. He talked about service, duty, and the honor of protecting important people, but he also emphasized that the most important part of being a good person, whether in the military or anywhere else, was having a kind heart like Emma's. The friendship between Emma and James continued long after the media attention died down. They exchanged letters and occasional visits, developing a genuine bond that extended far beyond their famous moment together. James often spoke to school groups about his military service, and he always included Emma's story as an example of how a single act of kindness could change someone's entire day, or even their life. Years later, when Emma was older and could better understand the full impact of what had happened, she would reflect on that day with amazement. She had simply seen someone who needed help and had offered what she could give. The fact that this simple gesture had resonated with millions of people around the world spoke to something fundamental about human nature and our deep need for connection and compassion. The story of Emma and James became a touchstone for discussions about kindness, empathy, and the power of small gestures to create meaningful change. It was retold in books about human goodness, referenced in speeches about the importance of compassion, and remembered as a bright moment during a day of mourning. But, perhaps most importantly, Emma's gesture started a ripple effect of kindness that extended far beyond that single moment. People who had been moved by her story began looking for their own opportunities to show compassion to strangers. Children around the world were inspired to perform their own acts of kindness. The simple act of a 6-year-old girl giving flowers to a sad soldier had reminded the world that even in our most formal, structured, and difficult moments, human kindness could still break through to touch hearts and change lives. Emma Mitchell had moved a Royal Guard, but, in doing so, she had moved the world. Her story became proof that the smallest gestures, motivated by the purest intentions, could have the largest impact. In a time when people often felt powerless to make a difference, a little girl with a bouquet of wildflowers had shown that anyone, regardless of age or circumstance, could change the world simply by caring enough to reach out to someone who needed kindness. The flowers she picked from her garden that morning were simple and humble, but they carried with them the power to remind millions of people about what truly mattered, not the grandeur of ceremony or the precision of protocol, but the simple human connections that bind us all together in our shared experiences of joy, sadness, and hope.